All right, we now turn to the next topic, the rise to power of J. Edgar Hoover. I'll begin at the beginning, part 1, the early years. King Jr. identified with his father. Hoover identified with his mother. Of English and German ancestry, John Edgar Hoover was born on New Year's Day in 1895 in Washington, D.C. to Anna, or Annie, Marie and Dickerson Naylor Hoover. They lived near Capitol Hill in a 2-story stucco house at 413 Seward Square. Edgar was the youngest of 4 children. He reveled in his mother's devotion. She spent any extra household funds on new outfits for him. Little Edgar was not interested in his father's work. He preferred to spend his time in the garden with his mother. By his first year at Brent Elementary School, Edgar was a gifted reader. A stutter developed that year that went unnoticed by his father. However, his mother took him to a specialist who suggested that Edgar speed up his speech. It worked. Before long, he earned the moniker Speed. This tactic improved his reading skill, enabling him to expand his growing library with books on history, geography, and religion. Edgar did not marry. He was still living with his mother during his 40s. J. Edgar Hoover and Dr. Donald Campbell MacLeod. Hoover upset his mother in his teens by switching from her Lutheran denomination to Presbyterian. Edgar did this because he was fascinated by a young Presbyterian preacher who was his ideal of manhood. According to biographer Kurt Gentry, Donald Campbell was a cleric who romped with the boys who were not sissies, and MacLeod was everything Edgar's father was not. Charismatic, athletic, spontaneous, and fun-loving. Kurt Gentry made this astute observation. Decades later, in a bizarre turn of events, the recollections of his boyhood idol figured prominently in the FBI director's hate-filled, highly personal vendetta against a man whom he refused to call Reverend, Martin Luther King, Jr. Surrounded in light while filled with darkness. Annie Hoover surrounded her youngest child, Edgar, with love and light. However, Annie's love had to compete constantly with a malevolent force that scared him. That force spewed from Edgar's maternal grandmother. She filled the young boy's mind with the darkness of racism. Hack describes these frightening sessions. On Sunday afternoons, racism entered the Hoover household as Edgar's grandmother, Margaret Schleichten, who lived conveniently across Seward Street at number 414, would settle herself in the Hoover parlor, extolling tales of her father, John Hitz. The heavily bearded Hitz would read from the Bible, casting down sinners with the enthusiasm of a revivalist missionary. The fury of hellfire and brimstone left little Edgar wide-eyed and determined to escape the fate of drunkards and heathens, characteristics Hicks routinely credited to the blacks. Edgar's only exposure to other races was through the servants who were employed in the Hoover household. The pervasive racism of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was a southern town. Jim Crow statutes did not allow black children to attend Edgar's segregated school. Racial segregation did not permit blacks to worship in the church that Edgar attended. Discrimination extended into the city's restaurants, barbershops, beauty salons, butcher shops, and music halls. When blacks and other minorities were allowed to mix with whites, they were expected to use separate entrances, bathrooms, drinking fountains, and telephones. Beyond the fact that this was reality, it was hard for white youngsters to understand, except that it could not be questioned and had to be protected at all costs. And so, little Hoover grew up into a man thinking that as an American, he had to defend what he saw as his heritage. Central High School in Washington, D.C. Because Edgar had become the apple in Annie's eye, she gave him whatever he wanted. So not surprisingly, she offered no resistance to Edgar's extraordinary announcement at dinner in the fall of 1909. Edgar declared that he intended to enter Central High School rather than his neighborhood school at Eastern High. But Edgar was slow to make friends at Central High. So he buried himself in tough classes, history, physics, and Latin. He sang in the school choir. Despite his stuttering problem, Edgar joined the school debate team in his sophomore year. The dark programming of Edgar's grandmother manifested itself in the positions he took in his debates. He argued against immigration and against women's suffrage. Of course, Edgar took a firm stand against civil rights, a characteristic that became more acute with time. J. Edgar Hoover and civil rights. Although he mentioned Edgar's stand against civil rights during his school debates, Hack missed the opportunity to discuss how this dark trait metastasized during Hoover's adulthood. And while Gentry mentioned Edgar's boyhood debate stand against women's suffrage, he too overlooked some of the details of how Hoover's ingrained antipathy to civil rights figured into the situation when he became an adult. Other well-known biographies of Hoover that mentioned his membership on the debate team likewise failed to mention this significant predictive characteristic that grew ominously from toddler to tyrant. It is true that the majority of little white boys were exposed to racism at that time, but those boys did not rise to the level of Hoover's powerful position in the American justice system. In 1948, FBI Director Hoover declared that he was, quote, not going to send in the FBI every time some nigger woman gets raped, unquote. As the years passed, Hoover's hatred for Dr. King aided the FBI director's transformation into a brutal monster. Hoover's inevitable clash with Martin Luther King Jr. When discussing the 1954 Supreme Court passage of Brown versus Board of Education, Hack's biography does address Hoover's bigotry. In that decision, the court determined that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and denied the legal basis for segregation in the 21 states that still allowed it. With the courts firmly on the side of equality, for the first time in his life, Hoover found himself obliged to enforce laws that he personally found in conflict with his own beliefs. He was, if nothing else, a gentleman of the Old South who believed that blacks were fine in their place, which to Hoover meant as servants, handymen, laborers, and field workers. King's sudden emergence as the leader of the civil rights movement in 1955 and 56 blindsided the FBI director. Hoover's hatred for Martin Luther King Jr. exploded, and his agents were ordered to dig up all the derogatory dirt they could on MLK. Hoover made up lies about King while slandering him as the biggest liar in America. The Central High School Brigade of Cadets. For the adolescent Edgar, the Central High School Brigade of Cadets was a dream because only the most popular and gifted male students were members. The cadets had to follow compulsory conventions and a demanding practice schedule. The brigade was divided into companies to practice their elaborate drills and marches. Those company units competed against one another in citywide contests. One of the distinctions Edgar loved most were the military uniforms provided to the cadets. Each cadet received slacks, a high-collar navy blue jacket, and gold epaulets on the shoulders signifying rank within the brigade. In his senior year, Edgar was honored by being selected captain of Company A. He commanded 6 squads that competed with the other 2 companies. Edgar's moment of glory came on 4 March 1913, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue past the newly installed President Woodrow Wilson and his First Lady. The CAIRO Hotel Annual Brigade of Cadets Regimental Ball. Ranked 4th in his class at Central High School, Edgar was selected valedictorian based on his academic achievement and moral character, according to Hack. In 1913, the 14-story tall CAIRO Hotel hosted the Brigade of Cadets annual dance. It was a rigid and highly formal affair. In the splendor of their blue and white uniforms, the participating young cadets that arrived had to be prepared with a dance engagement book. Those books had spaces that had to be filled out with the names of the cadets' female dance partners. Edgar's dance book, which he kept all his life, shows that he did not dance with a single girl. His classmate, Francis Gray, said Edgar wasn't a dater, didn't go with girls. Edgar's relatives noticed it. His niece Dorothy said Edgar never had any girlfriends. Never. George Washington Law School in the Library of Congress. Edgar was offered a full scholarship to study at the prestigious University of Virginia Law School. However, like his brother before him, Edgar had to decline the offer because the university did not include free room or board. Instead, Edgar accepted an offer to be a night student at George Washington University to complete its 4-year Masters of Law program. In addition, GW had the advantage of being close to Edgar's home. Edgar used his study at George Washington as a reference to obtain an entry-level job as a junior messenger in the Order Division of the Library of Congress, also a few blocks from his home in Seward Square. For the next 4 years, every day Edgar walked the few blocks from his home to his day job at the library. Afterward, he studied at the law school from 5 until 7, and then went home to study some more. He kept his 26 law books for the rest of his life. Alpha Nu Kappa Alpha and DC Federal Lodge Number 1. At George Washington, Edgar became the leader of the Alpha Nu chapter of Kappa Alpha, a Southern fraternity with origins at William and Mary College in Virginia. That experience would serve him well for the decades ahead. GW graduates, especially Kappa Alpha men, would later become his closest associates at the FBI. Edgar managed his fraternity house with a heavy hand. He prohibited the house capers, crap games, poker, and drinking parties. Edgar ordered the destruction of contraband by sending it crashing to the concrete areaway in the basement. According to his colleague William Gaxton, Edgar chastised us with his morality. In 1920, the 25-year-old Edgar Hoover was initiated as a Freemason at Federal Lodge No. 1 in Washington, D.C. He went on to join the Scottish Rite, in which he was made an honorary 33rd degree Inspector General in 1955. Summary. By the time Edgar graduated with a master's degree in 1917, he had 4 years of experience as a civil servant under his belt and came away with 4,000 pages of index notes on law. The day after Hoover passed the bar exam in the District of Columbia, he accepted a position with the Department of Justice as a low-level clerk. We continue now with our subject, the rise to power of J. Edgar Hoover. Part 2, Dark Shadows in Washington, D.C. Annie Hoover's private world with Edgar. Edgar's niece, Margaret, recalled that she sometimes thought that Edgar really had a fear of becoming too personally involved with people. 50 years later, FBI Assistant Director William Sullivan put it another way. Edgar didn't have affection for one single solitary human being around him. The only constant family connection for Edgar, far into the prime of his life, would be his mother, Annie. Once they were free of Edgar's father, a burden that both had resented, they became inseparable. Edgar lived at home with his mother until he was a middle-aged man. Only after she died in 1938 would he leave the house on Seward Square. And when he did find a home of his own, he would live there alone. Biographer Anthony Summers wrote, Edgar defended his fragile self like a nuclear bunker, who never, ever admitted he was wrong. Hoover erased his past. Edgar grew to manhood and closed the door on himself that he had kept since childhood. There are no more diaries and just a few intimate letters to help chart his 6 decades of adult life. In accordance with his wishes, his secretary destroyed his private correspondence, and likely much more after his death. Evidence survives, however, that exposes the hidden life of Edgar. The man who projected himself to the public as a firm, moral example of integrity was, as Summers says, a walking myth. It was a fairy tale, so carefully crafted that he came to believe much of it himself. He was a master con man, his aide William Sullivan said, one of the greatest con men the country has ever produced, and that takes intelligence of a certain kind and astuteness and shrewdness. In the previous slide, I said that Hoover erased his past, and will continue now as he reinvented himself. Summers wrote that it was true that Edgar had been a dominant leader in his Sunday school classes, but it was a fact that he later lied about as evidence that he had desired to become a minister. In 1990, a family member of his brother set the record straight. Quote, that thing that just keeps coming up about Edgar wanting to be a minister just isn't true. In our family, we've always known that. According to Summers, an FBI agent was Edgar's chauffeur for trips to the South, Leo McLaren, did not remember Hoover having gone to church once in 20 years of Christmas visits to Florida. Summers says Edgar's piety was a public sham. A bureau-approved article in 1960 would report that he would walk down the aisle of Washington's National Presbyterian Church every Sunday morning at precisely 9 o'clock. But in a later interview with Summers, the church's former pastor, Dr. Edward Elson explained that the article, quote, was not true, unquote. Edgar's false heterosexuality. Hoover's secretary, Helen Gandy, said that when Hoover was 24, he saw a good deal of a young woman named Alice working in the War Emergency Division. Alice was an attractive daughter of a prominent Washington attorney. But the only thing Hoover wanted out of it was he hoped that he might get a job if the end of the war with that guy, if the end of the war also ended his job at the Justice Department. Then Summers picks up this part of the story. According to Gandy, they had several dates. Edgar sent Alice a note asking her to meet in a restaurant to propose becoming engaged. Alice did not show up and became engaged to another man, a young officer who, unlike Edgar, had gone to war. Miss Gandy told me that Edgar's future aide, Carter DeLoach, recalled they, Hoover and Gandy, had a good time, but they weren't attracted to each other in that way. It cooled off, but later, when he needed a secretary, he called her. Edgar, Francis Garvin's pet. Alexander Palmer became Attorney General in 1919. Palmer hired William Flynn, former chief of the Secret Service, to head the Bureau of Investigation, with Frank Burke, Secret Service former Russian expert, as second in command. Palmer also created the General Intelligence Unit, which fell into the open arms of Hoover. As the unit's director, Hoover dined on a series of raids to seize and deport suspected radicals. Those raids were criticized by civil rights activists and legal scholars. Edgar's day-to-day chores were directed by Assistant Attorney General Francis Garvin, a counter-subversion zealot with a visceral hatred of foreigners, and Edgar soon became known as Garvin's pet. Hoover's records-keeping experience in the Library of Congress was now put to use, building a massive card index on left-wingers. John Lord O'Brien had also helped Edgar on his path to power. Years later, after Edgar's death, O'Brien spoke warily about Edgar. O'Brien was asked about his role in furthering the career of the youth who became J. Edgar Hoover. The old man admitted, "This is something I prefer to whisper about in dark corners. It's one of the sins for which I have to atone." Hoover's secret spies. With new power in the Justice Department, Edgar had a field day using the Bureau to spy on lawyers who represented people who were arrested or who had worked to expose the abuse of civil rights. To hide his perfidy, Edgar ordered that spying on the activities of civil rights lawyers had to be discreet and thorough. One of Edgar's targets was future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, then a distinguished Harvard Law School professor. Edgar kept a microscope on Frankfurter for half a century and privately demonized him as the most dangerous man in the country. Hoover's duplicity included spying on people, confronting them, and then intimidating them. But not for crimes, but for their political beliefs. After many awkward files had surfaced during the Red Raid hearings, Hoover quickly learned how to simulate the observance of due process. He also found ways to keep his greatest file treasures out of the public eye by simply locking them away in safer locations. Later, as FBI director, Edgar perfected a file system that was inaccessible to outsiders. The only FBI files released were used to serve Edgar's selfish purposes. Hoover becomes director of the Bureau of Spies. Summers' biography describes an incident involving Assistant Bureau Director Frank Burke. As a mentor of Edgar's career, Burke was enraged to hear that his protege was calling him a political hack behind his back. So Burke threatened to kick the hell out of Edgar, but when they met, the young Hoover had surrounded himself with 3 husky bodyguards, all on the department payroll. At the same time, Attorney General Dougherty was caught in corrupt deals during the feeble presidency of Warren Harding. Such continuing political abuse led to a propitious reshuffling of assignments connected with the Dougherty controversy. And wouldn't you know it, that restructuring opened the door for Hoover's promotion. And so it was in 1921 that J. Edgar Hoover joined the Bureau of Investigation as the assistant director. Moreover, the former New York City detective William Burns stepped into the position of the Bureau director. But he was a playboy who handed out jobs as political favors. And due to Burns' role in the Teapot Dome scandal, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone fired him, opening the door for Hoover to take over the directorship of the Bureau. From rubble to empire, as Summers rightly points out, neither Edgar nor Attorney General Palmer and the rest of his staff suffered the disgrace that should have resulted from the Red Raids. Congressional inquiries dragged on for so long until a new Attorney General had been appointed under a new president that everyone responsible had escaped retribution. On 20 May 1924, Edgar had been promoted to the acting head of the Bureau of Investigation. He told his mother that he had half expected to be fired too, but that the Attorney General Stone had growled, "Young man, I want you to be the acting director." The truth was different. Stone had been consulting, looking around, talking to cabinet colleagues, including the Commerce Secretary, Hubert Hoover, searching for a replacement for Burns. But in the end, Edgar drew the lucky straw. The day after the promotion on Mother's Day, Annie Hoover gave Edgar a star sapphire ring studded with diamonds. Feeding on the flesh of corrupt corpses, Edgar's inheritance would soon turn into an empire. Summary: an innocent little boy was turned to the dark side and rose to build his empire.